Hey folks, welcome back. It's Crazy Welder, and I'm going to be doing another vlog today about VR. And what I wanted to talk to you guys about is, should you hold off on VR right now? And there are a lot of kind of speculations going on as to what's going to happen in the VR world in the next, couple of years. There's talk of big people such as Apple coming in and ultimately revealing their next AR or VR solution to everyone. But the question really is it worth your time? Is it worth your money to pursue a VR solution currently? And I figured I'd walk you guys through some of the options that are currently out there and available to the consumer and see if any of those options kind of make sense and whether or not it really makes sense to actually hold off on buying them. And I'm going to start off by saying that I just recently talked to a buddy of mine who happens to own the PlayStation VR. He happens to own the Oculus Rift. He also happens to have the HTC Vive. And his impression so far is that the tracking is definitely by far the best with the HTC Vive. Now, obviously, this has to do with the fact that they use a multi-sensor and entire room tracking system, whereas the Oculus Rift actually just has a single sensor that basically looks and locks onto your Move controllers to kind of track your movement that way. And ultimately what that means is that the Oculus is really only capable of tracking your movement from head-on, as opposed to doing motion and tracking you and your movements in the whole room. But the question is, between those two specifically, which one kind of makes the most sense for you guys? And I guess the ultimate kind of question there is whether you want to spend a certain number of hours setting stuff up versus do you want to spend just a little bit of time and have access to a game store that makes it very easy for you to buy and purchase apps. And so the easy setup would be the Oculus Rift, and ultimately it has a dedicated app store where you can buy those games, where you can go and guaranteed be able to play them, day one out of the box with no problems, versus the HTC Vive that's going to require you multiple, probably hours of setup, ultimately clearing everything out of your room just to be able to play, a number of what essentially I would call is a bunch of tech demos at this point, as there are not that many games that support full-on VR with the HTC Vive. Now, there are a number of Steam VR titles that are going to be supporting the Vive much more openly, and certainly games that are going to be sort of backported to support the HTC Vive. But again, if you're having to go up around your room and set up all those different sensors and ultimately possibly even drilling holes into your room, it's one of those things that can certainly be very off-putting for a very lackluster, amount of titles out there. Now, having talked to my buddy about this, he has said that the PlayStation VR is the most comfortable headset out of the three that he has tried, and certainly the selection of titles there is much more compelling, as you have out-of-the-box availability of those games. You're able to just put in a disc and start playing right away with a minimal number of setup. The only real headache is going to be plugging in all those wires for the external processing unit, the HDMI, etc. But once that has all been set up and once you've calibrated the Move controllers, you're pretty much good to go. And considering you're looking at a price point of a console, which is $400, with the addition of this VR, the PlayStation VR headset, you're looking at another $400 for a total of $800 of a very respectable VR setup. It kind of becomes more clear which one you want to go with, as opposed to the $600 that you would ultimately end up paying with the Oculus Rift and the Move controllers that they have for the Rift, or the Oculus Touch controllers, and then ultimately, spending $800 on the basically equivalent on the HTC Vive. And so again, you're looking at setup times for the Oculus Rift on the PC being somewhere around a half hour or so, versus about 2 to 3 hours potentially with the HTC Vive, and possibly 15 minutes on a PlayStation VR. And again, at a much lower price point, because with the PC counterparts, you're going to be spending a lot of money on those devices. Now, the biggest thing to me between all of these is ultimately still the screen door effect. Now, what I want to point out here is that the optics on all of these devices are actually quite different, and I'll get into the other stuff that's available for mobile a little bit further on. But what I want to say first is that when I've played with the HTC Vive, I noticed that in particular, because of the lens and the way that it's got some ribbing on it, you can actually see a little bit of a halo effect around some of the image, especially if you're playing games where there's a lot of light. So for example, if you're doing an outdoor scene in a game like Ethan Carter, where it's The Vanishing of Ethan Carter, where you're outside pretty much most of the game, really, the halo effect gets quite annoying, and the screen door is still slightly noticeable in the outside areas, which partially has to do with the way that the displays on these devices are. And the reason I bring this up now is because both the Oculus Rift and the HTC Vive actually use Samsung displays from their mobile division, and all of those displays actually only have 2 subpixels, whereas the PlayStation VR actually has 3 subpixels. So even though on the PlayStation VR you don't have as high of a resolution as you do on the HTC Vive and the Oculus Rift, what you actually end up having is less of a screen door effect on the PSVR due to the fact that there's less of a distance between the pixels, and so as a result there's a lot more blending that happens between all of that, so it's less noticeable to the eye. Now the Oculus Rift goes kind of another way with the optics, where they have a kind of mixture between the ribbed optic that the HTC Vive uses and the standard optic that's used in the PSVR, and you get a kind of blending effect there as a result of that sort of optics that are next to your eyes, but at the same time, due to the fact, again, that it's using that same Samsung display, there's still a bit of a screen door effect that happens, and ultimately, you know, that kind of breaks immersion in a lot of ways. And the thing is, if you really want to be immersed in those games, and especially a lot of bright games, and there's a ton of them that are out there for VR right now, again, you would want something that limits that, and that's what the PlayStation VR can do. But the problem is, even though the PlayStation VR can actually be used on a PC, contrary to a lot of people's opinions about it, you can't actually plug it in and just run it from HDMI from your computer, and it will work fine. But you don't have the same tracking capabilities as you would with PSVR, because on the PC we just don't have the drivers for that stuff. Now there is a project currently in the works that is actually basically using some drivers from the original PlayStation Eye, which is the PlayStation camera used for the PS3, not to be confused with the PS2 iToy, but the one for the PlayStation 3, and they're actually able to track, I think, one of the Move controllers, and it works decently well on the PC, but again, it limits the number of games that you can ultimately play. There is currently a workaround, which is that you can use the Wii U or just original Wii motion controllers on the PC, and that kind of gets you to do some of the motion controls because they do have a magnetometer just like the PlayStation Move controllers, but again, you're limited to the number of games that support that stuff, and ultimately you have to go through and configure all of that stuff, which is just a huge nightmare. Now, is there a way to avoid this sort of issue with the screen where you get the screen door effect? And the answer is yes. There is actually a 4K VR headset that came out, which is called the Pimax. And currently the Pimax is, I believe, the only 4K VR headset that you can buy. And it's pretty incredible that this thing exists, but again, the issue is that there simply is not enough support out there for it, and certainly my computer can't run it, and I have an R9 390X. But even if I had my other computer, which has the RX 480, even in Crossfire, I still wouldn't be able to push that 4K resolution in a lot of games, because you're effectively rendering the game twice in most instances, just to get that sort of 3D immersion effect, and that certainly takes a huge toll on the hardware. But if you do want to go with the 4K solution, the Pimax is a way to go for you, and if you happen to be one of those people that has a number of, GTX 1080s lying around, or you just have, a really powerful graphical setup that perhaps uses multiple AMD cards or some of the older NVIDIA cards, then perhaps this would be a way to go. But my issue with using VR with multiple cards is that currently that introduces some micro-stuttering, and it's certainly visible on displays that do have high refresh rates. So for example, if your display is capable of 120 Hz or 144 Hz, you'll actually see some of that in the screen, and it almost, manifests itself as screen tearing and sometimes. And the issue is that we have VR headsets now that are capable of refresh rates of something like 90 Hz in the case of the PlayStation VR. Sometimes, that goes even higher. It just depends on the display that they're using. But ultimately, at the end of the day, what that means is that if you're running with a dual card setup, there is the chance for that micro stuttering to occur, especially if the drivers were not optimized for a Sly or Crossfire platform in that game, in which case, again, that's going to manifest itself in some certain artifacts that are going to be very noticeable and certainly distracting when you play the game. And for this reason, I think that the hardware currently is just not quite there yet, and I think perhaps the next generation of graphics cards, so for example AMD's Vega and whatever NVIDIA introduces next, will probably be more capable of running VR, and certainly running VR in 4K. But again, I just feel like at the current moment, not only are there not enough games out there to really do really great VR, there's just not enough really cool experiences to really put that forward, and at the same time, there just isn't really the hardware to currently run it at the speeds that really make it worthwhile and make it so that it doesn't break the immersion for the user. And ultimately, I think until we start seeing stuff like NVIDIA's G-Sync technology or AMD's FreeSync on some of these devices, having the screen tearing issue is going to be a big part of why VR might not necessarily catch on this generation. And considering how much the hardware costs, I still think that perhaps right now is the time to hold off. Now, what about other solutions? Are there other 4K headsets that are coming out? Is there more stuff that's going to be available to the consumer? And the answer is certainly. For example, Starbreeze, which is a company that some of you may remember as the guys that are behind Payday 2 as well as the Chronicles of Riddick games, they have been investing a lot of their time and money into what they call Star VR, which is their 4K headset. It's sort of cheating in a way because all it's doing really is it's taking the Samsung screen panels and putting one on your right eye and one to your left eye, and thus achieving that frame resolution, which is essentially the 4K resolution. And they're claiming a very high field of view, which is ultimately great for immersion, but again, even at the time of its release, which I'm guessing they're probably going to plan for a release in about a year or a year and a half or so, I don't really know if there's necessarily going to be hardware to push the most recent games at that resolution, at the proper frame rates, to be able to net you a really good result. But ultimately, there's another scene that's currently exploding, and that's the mobile VR scene. And the reason why this is really starting to blow up is because a lot of your smartphone features are already kind of pre-configured for a certain amount of inside-out tracking, meaning that this tracking comes from within the device itself as opposed to outside in, which is what, for example, the PSVR, the Oculus Rift, and the HTC Vive have, which is obviously a much more expensive solution. But your phone usually generally already has a gyroscope. Sometimes it's a multi-axis, for example, a 9-axis gyroscope. It also has an accelerometer and sometimes even a magnetometer, which all kind of combines together to make for a very, very nice, intuitive head tracking, and positional tracking that can actually be a lot cheaper than even using additional gadgets. But there are additional gadgets coming out, and one of them, of which I'm actually a backer, is called Nolo VR, which basically takes any cell phone kind of Google Cardboard type headset, puts a set of markers on it, and uses a external IR tracker to basically capture the movement. Now, this movement is going to be certainly somewhat room scale, but more in line with what Oculus has in terms of the front-facing tracking. However, it only costs $99 currently for this solution, and ultimately you'll be able to use it not only for mobile games, but you'll also be able to use it for Steam VR and other VR titles that are going to be available on PC. And I think given the resolution that modern phones have on their screen, and given the fact that you can get these headsets, which are something in the realm of like $20 nowadays, using it with that kind of solution ultimately I think is the future. And I believe that as cell phones reach that sort of peak where they also go into the 4K space, you're going to have much better ability to use those, and it's certainly going to be cheaper for the end consumer because you've already paid the price forward when you bought your cell phone. And to me, I think that's ultimately the way things are going to go, because we have USB-C in cell phones now, and that allows for much faster speeds, and certainly data transfer speeds. And considering we're talking about Intel and HTC Vive going wireless in the near future, meaning they're trying to cut the cord on the VR. That also means that there's probably going to be adapters such as Intel's WiGig, which is 60 gigahertz wireless technology. It may just end up manifesting itself as a device that you plug into your USB-C port, and then you simply stream the VR to your headset as, for example, you're walking around your house, or as you're just walking around your room, and you'll have wireless VR on your smartphone, which ultimately I think is the way that things are going to go forward. And ultimately, when you're looking at a headset like this, when it's something that's about $30, you know, it's very, very easy, very accessible for the average person, and certainly it makes it a lot easier for the setup as well, because most of these are going to come with great instructions and going to be very easy to use. And I believe that even for children, this is something that's going to be a big selling factor, because it can be something that can be just bought as a Christmas present, for example, or just something that you go to buy in a store, and it doesn't seem particularly convoluted or daunting, because you have this very simple thing where all you do is you open it up, you put your smartphone in, maybe you put a tracker on top of this thing, maybe you don't, and then you simply start playing the game that you want to play. And at the end of the day, I think that given that these headsets are really light, they've got a bunch of different people coming out with different designs, that means that you also have a lot of freedom of choice in terms of what kind of device you're going to have. And certainly there's going to be a bunch of people that are going to come out with even more and more comfortable versions of these headsets, and I think that ultimately that is the way that things are going to go, and I think that that is what most of you guys should ultimately hold off on. And the reason why I say this is because I've recently been testing stuff with my Note 7, and yes, believe it or not, my Note 7 is still running, and I really like this phone. I finally got the battery replaced in it, and its streaming capabilities are quite good because it's got 4x4 MIMO technology, and I have an AC 1200 external adapter that is able to actually send the data to this phone at extreme speeds. It's a repeater, and so I use it for the internet around my house, but it certainly is also helpful for VR as well. And I found that for the most part, the connection is pretty solid. Now, obviously, this phone doesn't have the 60 gigahertz technology, and I'm still essentially limited to what would be the equivalent of a USB 2 speed over Wi-Fi on this device. But considering that, when I played Styx Master of Shadows as well as Homefront 2, I have found that the resolution was good. The pacing for the most part and the frame rates was pretty good as well, but there was still some artifacting going on due to the fact that there are compression algorithms running in the background to make it ultimately work. However, it's still a fairly good solution, and when I use the USB-C with software like Trinus, I was actually able to get a really seamless connection, where the only issue I really saw was again the screen door effect, owing to the fact that these displays have the 2 sub-pixel format as opposed to the 3 sub-pixels that you see on the PSVR. But once phones end up moving away from that standard and moving more towards a 4K screen, and certainly moving towards, you know, having more sub-pixels, you're going to see them become, I think, the dominant force in the VR market. And essentially it's going to be probably the only way that people are going to experience VR until the glasses become a standard, and I think the glasses are still a far way off, considering that things like the HoloLens and the Meta VR are currently still very much in development stages and require a lot of external hardware to make them run properly. And the Microsoft HoloLens, certainly after seeing the demos out there online, it seems to have quite a bit of lag and has problem tracking the user's fingers. And until that is solved, you know, it is ultimately still going to be a really big problem for selling the devices, because they simply will cause a lot of frustration for customers. And ultimately, nobody wants to be running around with a giant backpack on, or even a set of really dorky looking huge glasses, because that just doesn't really fit with the public. And it certainly was the case for failure for, I think, the Google glasses, which I think, you know, were too dorky looking, they were too nerdy looking, they didn't have a good aesthetic, they just did not go with a design that fit with most people's lifestyle, and ultimately that was their downfall. But it was in the right direction. I mean, I think that if people are able to create glasses that actually look like regular glasses and maybe just are a little bit thicker, we'll finally reach that kind of consumer device that everybody will want to have, and that everyone will have, because they will have the processing power of your smartphone in a glasses type format, where you don't even have to look down anymore to be able to experience VR, to be able to text your friends and so on and so forth. But we're not quite there yet. And so with that said, you know, it's a lot of information to take in, but I do believe that certainly right now is the time to hold off and wait for the next generation, as even with the mobile VR, there's currently just way too much setup that happens. If you guys check out my video that I did on setting up mobile VR on the cheap as the Oculus Rift alternative, you'll see exactly what I mean by just how tedious the whole process ultimately is, because you have to have an app on your phone, you have to have an app on your PC, you have to have the Wi-Fi network configured properly, and you also have to have an application that runs 3D on the game itself if the game does not support VR or does not support 3D natively. And all of that just ends up being a very convoluted process that takes a long time to set up, and it's not as easy as plug and play. And with that said, you know, if that's something you want to do, you certainly can, but I can let you know right now that you can pretty much prepare yourself for disappointment, because quite simply there's just not enough horsepower in modern PCs, and there's not enough support in the depth buffer of these games to be able to give you the 3D effect that you would normally get from an actual, you know, game tailored for the VR experience. So hopefully you guys found this video helpful. If you did, you know, leave a like and please subscribe. If you do have questions, if you have concerns, or if you just want to comment and let me know about something that I missed or something you don't particularly agree with, just go ahead and comment below. Ultimately, that'll be the best way to get in touch with me. And see if you like these videos, see if it's something that you want to see me doing going forward, and ultimately, this is where the video is going to stop. And hopefully I've given you guys enough information to make a pretty good decision about VR currently. So I'll see you all in my next video, and take care.